Hello, class. My name is Magali Vega, and today we're going over after chapter 6, sections 3 and 4. This chapter is called Culture and Communication, and it is from our textbook called Communication in the Real World. So again, sections 6.3 and 6.4, culture and communication. So let's get started. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to go over is intercultural communication. So what is this defined as? So we can define this as communication between people with different cultural identities. So what is a cultural identity and what are the points that we can differentiate one person from another depending on this topic? So we have religion, we have ethnicity, we have gender, we have sex, and we can also do it as far as beliefs. So these are the most basic ones. And of course, religion, we have this that separates us. You wouldn't be able to tell if a person is of this religion or of that religion. So that's why when we come into conversation, it is one of the things that we could mention that could separate us. So we have Christianity, we have Catholicism, we have Jewish people, we also have people that practice the Muslim faith. So that's, of course, one of those things. Ethnicity. Most of us down here in the valley are mostly Hispanic or Mexican Americans. But when we travel to other places, when communicating, we have to take into account that we might be traveling to a different country. So then that would be a cultural identity that somebody else can, of course, identify as and make us different. That would change, of course, the way we communicate with them. We have gender, we have sex, and we also have beliefs. So let's move on. So why is this important? So a key point that is important to remember is this makes us more self-aware and competent in our communication towards different individuals. So let's say we have a conversation with somebody who is culturally different from us, identifies, of course, a different way. So one of the problems that we might run into this would be cultural appropriation. This term has gotten a lot of rise in social media lately. Cultural appropriation is when we have kind of a sort of ignorance towards somebody else's culture. So this could be, of course, again, a problem that arises. Examples that we can see on the media of this is food that is typically into someone's cultural identity, or maybe hairstyles, or maybe clothing, or maybe words that are commonly used in somebody else's or another group's cultural identity. And of course, not being able to understand them or credit or reference them. So that's one of the problems. Another thing would be language differences. So let's say that, and we have here in the image people of different cultures trying to talk to each other, but they identify as different culturally. So there's this disconnect right there. There's the question mark. They don't know what each other is saying. So of course, if we learn to communicate more adequately with people who are identifying themselves as different culturally, we won't have these questions and we can better adapt to their styles of communication. One of the examples that I can give here is people who are, I guess, a term that, not a term, but a ethnic group or a cultural group that comes to mind would be um, Asians or Japanese people. Um, they like to, or their culture entails them to bow before speaking or saying certain terms instead of names, kind of how Westerners say yes sir, no sir, and stuff like that. So that would be some key points to, kind of think about when visiting a different country and expecting them to communicate in that way. So makes us more competent in our communication towards individuals that are different than us. So what are some of the roadblocks that we can encounter if we don't learn to communicate with others in an appropriate manner? So we have the term called ethnocentrism. So this is the evaluation of other cultures according to perceptions originating in the standards and customs of one's own culture. So we are, of course, going to think, well, that's what a lot of people think, but that doesn't mean that it's true and it doesn't mean that it's right. But we're always going to think or if we, live by this ethnocentrism, we're going to think that we're superior because we fail to understand or we negate ourselves from understanding the different cultures that can, of course, surround us. So then, how do we combat ethnocentrism? We have, of course, the dialectical approach. This is an excerpt from the book. And we have all the different kinds of dialectics. So there's 6 different kinds. So there's cultural, which connects to individual. There's personal, which connects to contextual. There's differences, which go to similarities. There is static, which goes to dynamic. History and past, which is kind of the most easiest one to identify. And there's also present, future, privilege, and disadvantage. So dialectical approach, dialogue between people holding different points of view about a subject but wishing to arrive at the truth through reasoned argumentation. Okay, so again, these are all of them. So next we're going to have what they mean, and we're going to go over this so that later on we can do an activity where we are going to mix and match, where I provide examples. So 6 dialectics of intercultural communication. Number 1, cultural individual dialectic. This helps us account for exceptions to cultural norms. So this is where I said of a person traveling someplace else and seeing that people communicate in a different way. We're going to have to take into account how we communicate to be able to have a meaningful conversation or be able to get to the point that we want to get to. For example, if we're asking for directions, if we're asking how to order on a menu, or if we simply just want to communicate, we have to acknowledge that we're entering a different cultural group where people identify differently and where their customs and culture and dialogue and their verbal and physical cues when talking are going to be different. So we have to acknowledge all of that. So then we have personal contextual dialectic, which highlights the connection between our personal patterns of and preferences for communicating and how various contexts influence the person. Next, we have difference, similarities, dialectic, which allows us to examine how we are simultaneously like and different from others. Next, we have a static dynamic dialectic. This suggests that culture and communication change over time, yet often appear to be and are experienced as stable. Next, we have history, past, present, future dialectic, which reminds us to understand that while current cultural conditions are important, that our actions now will inevitably affect our future. Those conditions are not without history. And lastly, we have privileges and disadvantages. This captures the complex interrelation of unearned systematic advantages and disadvantages that operate among our various identities. So like I said, next we're going to have a little activity where we can mix and match. So we have 2 people from different countries, and they ask for help at an airport. So we have 2 subjects. Let's say one is of an Asian country and this other person is American. They, of course, in the scenario, don't speak each other's language. And one of them just needs directions. So we're going to go to mix and match it. And this one would be cultural individual. Next, my friend who was my coworker is now my boss. So this one goes from personal to contextual because they went from knowing this person on a different type of level, and now they have to communicate as far as the change in scenario. So now that person is my boss, we have to change the way that we communicate, right? This one would be the static dynamic because there is changes and something that would otherwise be kept the same. Next, we have the example. Some people think Kamala Harris will be a bad president because she is a woman of color. This is, of course, the privilege and disadvantage. Not only is it seen here as she is a woman of color, but she is also a woman, and we're hearing a lot of that. I don't want a woman president, blah, blah, blah. A woman, much less a Black woman. It's a lot of things that we're hearing, and I would put that in privilege disadvantage. Memorial Day is not about celebration, it is about remembrance. This is history past, present, and future. The reason that it's this is because we have to recognize the holiday or the day as a day of remembrance because there's a history behind that. and not communicated in such a way of, how are you celebrating Memorial Day? Well, we're not actually celebrating Memorial Day because the history behind that says that it's to honor the fallen, right? And lastly, we have a woman uses she, her, they, them pronouns. This one would go into differences and similarities because even though we're expressing a similarity in that she is a woman, she's also setting herself apart because she also uses they, them pronouns. So it can be interchangeable. So that is the mixing and matching activity that I have prepared for you guys. So let's move on. So we move on in the chapter. I believe now we would be in section 6.4. So intercultural communication competence. Now we're talking about competence. We're not just talking about cultural differences. Now we're talking about how to be more competent in a way of communicating with people that are different than us. So again, the ability to communicate effectively and appropriately in various cultural contexts. So this also talks about why we want to have this type of communication. So we're met with two terms, intrinsic versus extrinsic communication, which are motivations for us to communicate. So what motivates us to communicate? Do we want to learn more about people? Are we curious about people? Or is there something to gain out of that? That would be more of like a selfish motive. So intrinsic, a healthy curiosity that drives him or her toward intercultural encounters to learn more about self and others. Then there is a foundation from which to build additional competence, relevant attitudes, and skills. I personally name this as a growth incentive because you're genuinely curious. You want to find out more about this person's culture. You want to find out more about having a conversation with them. You want to understand them better. And in case you did get something wrong in your prior communications, now you want to be better. You want to do better. So this is a growth incentive. This is I'm not going to say selfless, but it's of course you're not gaining anything materialistic from it, or there's no greed to it. Next, we move on to extrinsic, which is the desire for intercultural communication. And it is driven by an outside reward like money, power, or recognition. This is, of course, how I would categorize it as a selfish incentive because you're gaining something from it. It's personal gain. It's not to make your communication skills better. It's okay, I'm getting something out of this. So if these words are too hard to say or you can't remember them, are you growing from this communication and from learning, or do you have something to gain?
¿Vas a hacer ese package?
So
Me parece que
practice cultural self-awareness. This is the part of the lesson where we would have a open discussion. So in this discussion, I would ask, what are some visual indicators that can help us be more aware when communicating? So a lot of people, um, we don't know that they're different by just looking at them. We don't know that they identify different culturally by looking at them. We have to wait and for them to speak. We have to wait for them to use body language. We have to wait for them to say something about them. So let's say
okay.
that there were visual indicators. What would be one of them? So pause for discussion, asking the class what one of these visual indicators would be.
Okay.
So maybe one of them would be if they wear a something that is to a certain culture. So for example, a hijab,
So,
or
era
for
de
example, if they are wearing a Mandarin style shirt buttons, um,
Oh, okay.
if they're wearing
Okay.
a bindi
The jury.
on their forehead, uh, the way that they're dressed, of course. If they're dressed in robes, what kind of clothes they're wearing, that would be something to look out for. You would already approach that person knowing that when you're going to try to be part of the conversation, if you're going to want to approach them differently and ask questions to gauge the communication before getting into the point of conversation that you're usually wanting to go with. So, what are some verbal indicators that can help us communicate, that can help us better communicate with someone? So, let's say that there is no visual indicator that this person is different from us. Once we speak, what is something that lets us know
Okay.
that they're going to be different? Us, it's probably going to be hard to understand, not just verbally, but in all senses, also in the way that they communicate with their body. So what is some verbal indicators that can help us communicate with somebody? Maybe an accent, maybe the whole language that they're speaking, maybe words that they say. For example, Hispanics would say something like "mijo," maybe somebody who's Caucasian won't understand that.
Era una trata de
Uh, New Zealand won't understand that. So the way that they refer to somebody, again, we said their accent, we said the language as a whole, Spanish versus English versus French. We also know that people in Europe, when they say hi, they kiss on both sides of the cheek. So that would also be an automatic giveaway that, if they identify different culturally. So that is another indicator. So any more examples?
sí, ese
So
que
of course, this makes us being self-aware is going to help us better communicate. We can't always approach somebody expecting them to always speak English or always speak Spanish or always say yes ma'am, no ma'am, or always do a handshake or always do a kiss on the cheek to greet or a hug. Everybody is going to communicate differently. We have to learn how to assess the situation. We have to look at their verbal cues and their physical cues as well to see how to approach this. Of course, self-awareness, making us better communicators. Okay. And this, of course, is my lesson plan. We went over introduction, defining the keywords. What is intercultural communication? Examples of cultural identities.
sí,
How do
por
we
si acaso.
benefit from identifying cultural identities?
Bueno,
What is the benefit? What are we gaining from this? We're gaining the fact that we are better communicators. Okay. Ethnocentrism, we went over this, negative effects, and how can we combat it? This is where we approach the 6 different dialectics, introduce a dialectical approach, 6 different dialectics, and where we can identify them with examples, real life examples. What is intercultural communication competence? What motivates us to communicate? Is it a selfish gain?
tiene la foto, me la
Is it a
ese es un box
gain of
o un
growth? What is it?
Ok,
And let's
y de
find
la
out
ciencia sería
if
yo,
we are self-aware, like all communicate.
¿También?
Are we
ok.
self-aware? Could we work on that? And again, it's a great benefit to be able to be self-aware in these situations.
Ok, muchas gracias.
So that
Ok,
was communication in the real world, chapter 6.3 and 6.4.